This is TWiT.
This episode of Tech Break is brought to you by ACI Learning. The most tech-savvy people in the world serve in the military, and deciding how to transition to civilian life can be difficult. Before 2030, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported IT will add over 667,000 positions. Choose a career to support your goals with ACI Learning. Visit go.acilearning.com/twit today.
It's often been called the holy grail of wearable devices. It is the idea that the numerous people in the United States and around the world who need to track their blood glucose should be able to do so without having to prick their finger, replace a sensor that goes on their forearm, or any number of other means by which we track our blood glucose levels. Apple has been working on this for some time and has reportedly made some major progress in the field. Joining us today to talk about what he knows, it's Bloomberg's own Mark Gurman. Welcome back to the show, Mark.
Hey, Micah. Thanks as always for having me.
Yeah, thanks as always for joining us to talk about this. So let's kick things off. Tell me about kind of how long, because I was surprised in reading your piece, how long has Apple been at this?
Yeah, this actually dates back to the Steve Jobs era, right? Apple bought a company called Light out of New Mexico in 2010 and hired its founder, who was also its only engineer, Bob Messerschmidt, to develop this non-invasive glucose monitor, eventually destined for the Apple Watch, or at least that was the goal at the time when they bought this company. And they've been working on it now. That makes it about 12, 13 years. And recently they've hit major milestones. They made major progress, and they now believe that they're at a proof of concept stage, and they have a pathway to bringing non-invasive glucose monitoring continuously to an Apple Watch, at least in this decade, hopefully.
Yes. So that was going to be our next question. I'm glad that you brought that up. Before we dig into the details of this, it's not something that we're going to see in the next Apple Watch, but instead is something that is finally past, it seems, the stage of, well, that'd be a cool thing to do, and is finally in the realm of, we might be able to make this happen. Is that correct?
It's past R&D, right? It's past R&D. So it's more at a proof of concept stage. They got the underlying tech working. It's now about shrinking it to a sensor stack that could fit in a smartwatch. In terms of this year's Apple Watch, no, it won't be in this year's watch. This year's watch is actually going to be a pretty minor update. You're going to see, minor changes on health and watch OS and faster processors in the Apple Watch models for this year. Blood pressure tracking, another key health feature you would want in a smartwatch, that'll come before glucose. I don't think glucose is going to come until a bit later in the decade, but it's something that's actively being worked on across, a special team dedicated to this, but also the Apple Watch hardware engineering organization.
Got it. Now, because you brought it up, now I want to take a brief jaunt over into blood pressure territory, because something that I noticed about this piece that we're going to get to even more is you really go into depth about the technology behind it. So before we hit that, you say blood pressure could come first. How, if we know, how in the world can we use a watch and the sensors in the watch to actually track blood pressure? Are we going to have a watch band that inflates on our wrist and then deflates afterward?
It's similar underlying technology where it's using sensors to actually read the pressure of the blood beneath your skin. And it's basically the idea of, to your point, not having to use an inflating cuff. Right. So the idea is not having to do that. They want to do a cuffless sort of blood pressure system. That's something that's been in the works for quite a while at Apple as well. Way further along than the glucose project, I'd say, but probably equally as important, right, to many people around the world. So that'll come probably in the next 2 or so years.
Yeah. And this is, what it boils down to in the end, it seems, is a lot of work with algorithms. Tell us about where Apple has focused its attention in terms of making constant glucose monitoring possible on something as small as an Apple Watch. I know that, they're still working on making the technology smaller and smaller, but how does one even begin to figure out someone's blood glucose level without actually going into the blood and determining how much glucose is there?
Okay, so it uses a technology called optical spectroscopy, as well as a new chip technology called silicon photonics, right? And essentially, just to break it down, it's using lights and lasers that shoot light into what is known as interstitial fluid. That's fluid that flows out of your blood capillaries. Everyone has this fluid beneath their skin, right? And so what the light does, it shines through your skin into that fluid, right? And it's able to then reflect back to sensors beneath the watch. And what's reflecting is the concentration of glucose within that fluid. So it's not measuring the blood per se, it's measuring the amount of glucose within that fluid. And the system then uses an algorithm to convert the meaning of amount of glucose in your interstitial fluid to what that would mean for the amount of glucose in your blood. Hence, it receives your blood sugar information.
And I guess now comes the question, how... So one of the things that we've seen is Apple, I remember Apple announcing, excuse me, differential privacy. And what was interesting about their announcement of differential privacy, which is this idea, and I'm not going to go into the technical aspects of it, but through a bunch of numbers and magic, you can make it so that, excuse me, information can be shared with Apple, but it is not tied back to an individual. And this was at a time when Apple was, really kind of stepping up its game with the Apple Watch, making it more of a product that tracked health. And as Apple has been able to gather more information, both itself and then also through the different research studies that it's done, well, in partnership with different organizations, it has helped to improve upon the technology. So this is all leading to my question of, if we don't have this blood glucose monitoring system already out in the wild, being able to kind of make subtle adjustments based on what it's learning, how does Apple go about testing this without everybody finding out about it until Mark Gurman publishes a piece on Bloomberg to let us know about it? Because this has been going on, as you mentioned, for years. So how did they do this in secret?
First of all, it's a great question. In terms of the differential privacy on the device itself, I would imagine all the algorithms are tied to the phone and the watch directly. So none of this is happening online, and it's not really being stored online out of an encrypted environment. So for anyone who's concerned about Apple getting your glucose level information, I don't think that's a real concern at this point. In terms of how they've kept this secret. So this team, right, actually began as a fake startup that Apple created around 2011 called Avalante Health LLC, actually based in Palo Alto. And the team and the engineering work was done out of this facility in Palo Alto. And the reason they made a fake startup is to answer that question, right? How do they keep this secret? Well, you can do human trials, you can do partnerships, you can buy supplies from different providers and such, different partnerships without them knowing you're Apple. So they've done many trials with humans over the last several years, but these humans thought they were doing trials for a startup called Avalante. They had no idea it was Apple.
Wow. Okay, that is interesting. Now, I like that in your piece, you also talked to two big companies, Dexcom, Abbott Laboratories, and talked about them. Kind of where do those companies exist in this lineup of all the way from going into the doctor, having your blood drawn, having the blood glucose measured through that, to I'm at home, I prick my finger, I put the little thing against my finger and it reads it, to the thing that you put on your arm that you have to replace every once in a while, all the way now to constant blood glucose monitoring in a way where you don't even have to replace it regularly. Are those companies working on things themselves? Do you think that we'll see anything from them before Apple gets to this, or is Apple kind of at the forefront as far as you've been able to see?
Yeah, and another great question. So I don't think that Abbott and Dexcom are in sort of the process for when you go to your doctor and you get a vein-based draw, right? So really the two types of ways to get the glucose levels right now is a vein draw, which is when you go get your blood test at the doctor or Quest or what have you. The other one is a capillary blood draw. That's when you prick the skin yourself and get a blood sample from there and put it on one of those little machines that you can buy at the pharmacy. Abbott and Dexcom both sell machines like that. They've also both made patches. I don't know if you watched the Super Bowl, but I don't know which Jonas brother, but one of the Jonas brothers was in a Super Bowl ad for Abbott. They have a patch called the Free Libre, and that patch is awesome for diabetics. It pricks your skin. That's the big difference from Apple. It goes into your bicep. And it can get that data continuously, but it has to be replaced every 2 weeks. Obviously not as convenient as the smartwatch solution, but in terms of where we are today, I think it's great. In terms of what they're working on, Abbott got back to us last night and told us that they're still looking into continuous non-invasive glucose measurement systems that could be similar to what Apple's working on. It's unclear what the status of the Dexcom and the projects from Abbott are at this point, but obviously they want to look into that next step, and maybe there's an opportunity for Dexcom and Abbott to work with Apple on this. The other side of the coin is that many startups and major companies, including Google, have tried to do this. If you remember, Google had a project that they kicked off in 14, they actually shelved in 18, that measured glucose through your teardrops. Right? So there isn't a way to non-invasively measure the actual blood. You sort of have to work around it, right? And Google's approach to working around it was to get glucose out of your tears. That's why they made contact lenses, right? Apple's approach is to measure the amount of glucose in your interstitial fluid because that's very connected to blood. And there's an algorithm that they've created that can do that conversion on the fly.
Got it. Yeah. So just two different methods. And I think that's kind of what's been interesting is how different companies are attempting to tackle it through different means. Now, one last thing here. I found it kind of fascinating, the almost nesting doll nature of Apple's engineering teams, because you talk about the technology development group, which is working on the mixed reality headset. And then there's the special projects group, which is working on the self-driving car stuff. And then there's XDG, Apple's exploratory design group, which is working on this. From your understanding, do each of these groups kind of know about the existence of the other sort of secret groups? And then my bigger question, and I don't know if you even have the answer to this, is it possible that an engineer working in the special projects group could also be an engineer working in the XDG group? Or is there, do you think, separation between these teams entirely?
Yeah, Apple's very compartmentalized, right? It's very likely that, people working in XDG have no idea what's going on in SDG or in TDG, right? And so, it's possible, but I would imagine not.
Got it. Well, Mark Gurman, thank you so much for taking some time today to talk to us about this. Of course, we'll be keeping our eyes peeled as we see what comes out in the next couple of years before we get to blood glucose monitoring, hopefully at some point in the future. Always appreciate the work that you're doing over on Bloomberg. If folks want to follow you online and make sure they're staying up to date with that work, where should they go to do so?
Yeah, thank you. Bloomberg.com/poweron to subscribe to my weekly column, and then twitter.com/Mark Gurman, and you can get a link to all my articles from there. And Micah, thank you and the team as always for having me, and hope to see you soon.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.